Okay, today's conversation topic is making difficult decisions. And to do this, I am joined today by Eric Pliner, who is a CEO of a global consulting organization, as well as the author of the book Difficult Decisions: How Leaders Make the Right Call with Insight, Integrity, and Empathy. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Where are you joining us from today?
I am joining you from Brooklyn, New York today, which is where I spend most of my waking hours.
Very good. So maybe you can give our viewers and listeners a brief overview of yourself and your background and who you are.
Sure, great. So I am the chief executive of YSC Consulting. We are, as you noted, a global leadership strategy consulting firm headquartered in London, the other place where I spend waking hours when I'm not in Brooklyn, New York. We have consultants operating from 10 countries, working in 50, and we've been around for 32 years with a combination of the behavioral sciences, business psychology, but also business and leadership backgrounds among our people, helping leaders to understand the individual leadership styles, the dynamics and interactions, and the total organizational cultures that drive successful achievement of strategy. I've been with this firm for 12 years, the chief executive for the last 3, but I started my career in diversity, equity, and inclusion programs with a government program in the United States, have worked in government, nonprofit organizations, spent a number of years in the Bloomberg administration of the city of New York before joining YSC back in 2010.
Very good. So why did you write this book?
Yeah. Well, so the through line of my career for almost 25 years now has been working with leaders of all different kinds, from young people to educators to lawyers to university professors to business leaders and well beyond. And one of the themes that I noticed consistently is that the challenges that leaders are most troubled by, that they most grapple with, are the ones that don't have the ability to be solved easily through the use of ostensibly objective data. They're difficult because they're human, because they have real implications for real people's lives. And no matter how much data we gather, no matter how much analysis we do, we're not able to make the decision without having some effect on people. That humanity took me to the idea that actually there was a deeper understanding of our own morality and our collective ethical context that would make a big difference for leaders trying to make a difficult decision. And so I wanted to create something that was an easy read, but that gave readers a reasonable tool or set of tools by which to assess their own morality, to understand their ethical context, and to make sense of the two of those in light of the responsibilities of their roles.
Very good. So you've started answering this question already, I guess. But
Yeah.
what makes a difficult decision, and how is it different from other everyday decisions we make every day? And have you got some examples of what you would consider a difficult decision?
Sure, sure. The way that I'm talking about difficult decisions, again, is in the context of those very human, complex, subjective choices that affect people's lives. There are tough choices that leaders have to make all the time, but those can often be made through an aggregation of an analysis of data through a direction that is about aligning our day-to-day actions to our strategic ambition or aspiration. But what I'm talking about is the stuff that, again, never has an easy answer, that avoiding the answer is actually making a choice in and of itself, not necessarily an advisable one, and that whatever choice you make is bound to make some people happy or at least relieved, and bound to disappoint others. Those decisions become difficult because, again, that notion of our personal morality, what we believe about right and wrong, our ethical context, what the collective context that we're operating in has to say about what is helpful or what is harmful, and the responsibilities of our roles, what our stakeholders are expecting of us, and how we execute on those expectations. When any of those 3 things come into conflict with one another, that's what makes for a difficult decision. So I'll give you a real example, as you requested. one that I think a lot of leaders have grappled with over the last couple of years in the context of thinking about returning to the office, wanting to bring people back together to be in physical spaces together. Leaders have had to suddenly navigate creating some kind of a health policy. Do we require people to be vaccinated? Do we require people to wear masks? Do we have minimum numbers of people that can be in spaces at the same time? In some jurisdictions, that's been made easier by the existence of laws. Then you just say, well, we're following the law, and that decision is made. But there are plenty of places where the law leaves a lot up to interpretation all over the world. And so what a number of leaders have expressed grappling with is a personal moral view that decisions about bodily autonomy, what I do with my own health, should be left to the individual. We should all get to decide for ourselves what's right for us, seemingly straightforward. But a conflict then with a collective ethic that suggests that in the interest of public health, we know that we can control or at least manage aspects of the spread of the coronavirus through a number of measures that are more effective the more people who engage in them. Vaccinations, wearing masks. So now we have a conflict. The ethics says we should require more people to engage in a behavior in the interest of public and community health and stemming the spread of a pandemic. But the moral view might suggest that actually I don't want to tell people what to do with their own bodies or their own health. So what do I do? In the case of that conflict, when any two sides come of the triangle of those three dimensions that I referenced come into conflict with one another, look to the third. The third in this case is, again, your role responsibilities. So as a leader, what's my responsibility? It's to make sure my business can be productive. It's to make sure my people are healthy and able to deliver on their responsibilities, that they and their families and communities are taken care of. So ultimately, it's clear that in order to be able to deliver that, I either have to give people choice about whether or not to come into the space, or if they are going to come into the space, to create a set of measures that align to that ethical expectation of public health. A difficult decision, no doubt, but one that leaders may come to different conclusions on, and that's reasonable in part based on the nature of their business or organization, but one where seeing the conflict between two sides can help to be sorted through review of that third dimension.
So you talk about ethics, about morale, about values. How do you distinguish between them?
Yeah, this is a thing people like to ask about a lot. Why aren't we just talking about values? Are we really going to talk about morals in the workplace? That sounds dodgy to people. It sounds like, are you trying to bring religion into the workplace? Or are you trying to talk about my upbringing? But I'll explain the difference. Values are aspirational. They're what we want to stand for. They can be what we say we stand for, and that's typically true. I don't think people are lacking in integrity when we articulate our values, but they are aspirational. There's no real consequence if we say that we value something, but we don't necessarily align our behaviors to it. The reason for that is partly because there are lots of different ways to interpret value statements. They're also subject to social desirability. The organizations that release value statements are often saying what they think people want them to say. What does this organization stand for? Doesn't mean we shouldn't have them, but they're not necessarily super helpful on their own in making a difficult decision. So morals are a little bit different. While they represent some similar things, if values are what we stand for, morals tell us what we won't stand for, what I'm not okay with, what I absolutely won't allow. They represent the bright, bold line drawn with a thick black Sharpie that we stand on one side of, and that we clearly understand this is right and this is wrong. And so knowing what our values are and where we would draw the line makes it a lot more obvious, but also a lot more evident how we will make a difficult decision when we're really up against a stressful situation or a challenging question. Morals are internal, so they're personal to us. There's not universal agreement on right and wrong, but they are certainly externally informed. We get our ideas of our morality pretty early in life. Most of us have developed a sense of what we believe to be right and wrong by around the age of 10 or 11. So the goal in talking about morals is not to influence people's morality or try to change their view. We probably wouldn't be successful even if we wanted to, but to help us to understand where are we coming from? Where did we get our ideas about right and wrong? And how does that affect the way that we lead? Ethics are the inverse. They are externally determined and internally distilled. We make sense of them internally, but an individual can't determine ethics on her or his own. Ethics are a collective view of what's helpful or harmful. An important distinction, ethics are not necessarily about what's most popular. So when I say a collective view, it can be that a highly popular view isn't necessarily the most ethical one. But if you look at the notion of what will cause the least harm and enable the most help in a particular context, whether that's a professional body, a licensing body, a company itself, or an organization, even within a family, the collective ethic is our shared understanding of what's most helpful and what's most harmful. You need all three. You need values, you need morals, you need ethics. But although we often use that language interchangeably, it's the distinctions between them that actually make them really useful in making a difficult decision.
Okay, so what role should ethics, morals, and values play in a leader's decision-making practices then?
Yeah, great question. Well, the truth is that ethics and morals, and to a lesser degree, values, play a role in every decision that a leader makes. Doesn't mean we necessarily have made those explicit or that we even understand what they are, but we have a lens through which each of us sees the world. We have criteria by which we evaluate decisions. We may not be fully aware of them or have even given them any thought, but they're always there. And so, on the one hand, we could spend all of our time talking about morality, about right and wrong, all of our time talking about ethics, about helpfulness and harmfulness, about what's good or bad, but then we'd never get any work done. We'd never actually accomplish anything. We're not here just to talk about right or wrong or good or bad. With that said, if we aren't conscious of the role that those things play, then our ability to do the work that we're here to do, to achieve the objectives of our organizations, of our teams, to help our people to achieve their goals, is seriously compromised. The risk is that we get completely distracted by the conditions around us because we're not satisfied with, or we don't believe that there's integrity in the way that people are using their ethical context, their internal moral code, or their espoused values to make those decisions. So what's the role it should play? Number one, the leader should be really aware of their own personal morality, the sources of it. Where does it come from? Where did I get the idea that something is right or wrong? How is that informing the way I'm looking at this situation? Number two, constantly surveying the landscape to understand how has the ethical context changed, and how might changes in that ethical context lead me to a different decision than I might have made a year ago, 5 years ago, 5 minutes ago. And then finally, being really clear about the responsibilities of my role. That is, who are my stakeholders? What are their expectations of me? And what do I do when their interests come into conflict? Using all of those all the time is not about starting something new because it's already happening, but instead about making something explicit or conscious that might have been implicit or subconscious.
Okay, so you say morality obviously is then an important component of making difficult decisions. So how can people best understand the sources of their own morality and then honestly apply those morals and the self-awareness of this to their decision making?
Yeah. The first is to go back to early stages of life to understand where did I get my ideas about right and wrong from. Typically, when I ask groups of people, where did you get your morality from? What are the sources of it? The answers are often largely the same: parents, family, community, faith, maybe where I grew up or growing up in multiple places around the world, sometimes from literature or other arts. But they generally cluster around how people first encounter ideas, how they make sense of those ideas, and how the people, particularly adults around them in childhood, act on or don't act on those ideas. And there's a component, certainly, of our own way of interacting with the world that exists even before we're born. Genetic components, we increasingly understand, inform aspects of our neurology that certainly inform the way that we respond to stimuli. And then how we make sense of those is filtered through all of the lenses that I mentioned before and more. So going back to the beginning, saying, where did I get my ideas about this stuff from? And what do I really think? where did I get the idea that this thing is wrong and this thing is right? And now, with the benefit of hindsight and life experience, do I still think that? Is that really what I think? And the way to push on that is to use an exercise that I think McKinsey actually introduced probably about 50 years ago, which is the notion of the 5 whys. Once you establish why you think something, ask yourself, well, why do I think that? And therefore, why do I think that? And keep going. And by the time you get through 5 rounds of asking yourself why, you can typically get to the core understanding of the reason behind your action and whether it's actually what you would take if you made that rationale explicit. And so starting with really deep self-understanding, super, super important. My last bit of counsel to leaders who have done that exploration or who are constantly exploring the sources of their morality and whether it aligns to their explicit worldview is to think about what parts of that they want to communicate. What do I want other people to understand about how I see the world, about how I evaluate right and wrong, and what the implications are for their followership and for our work together?
Very good. So, do you have any ideas of good exercises or good exercise people can do to help them clarify their own desired moral leadership brand or reputation?
Yeah, sure. I'll give you a couple of examples, and some of these are detailed in the book as well. One is to think about receiving a lifetime achievement award, or if you're feeling especially daring, to think about your eulogy. But at some marking point later in life, or at the end of a stage of life or of life in general, imagine that you can't say anything about your achievements. We can't talk about your resume. We can't talk about your career, but instead you are to be described as a person. What would you want people to say about you? How then would someone who is learning about you for the first time come to understand those aspects of who you are, how you interact in the world, how you lead as a person in an organization, in a community, in a family, and beyond? Those descriptors can provide you with great data about what your self belief is and what your aspirational self belief is. How well does that description align with what you do on the day to day right now? And if you're not totally happy about it, then to ask yourself, what would you need to do differently to be manifesting your underlying morality and the way that that connects to the way you want to be in the world? Another slightly less intense example, although it can get pretty intense depending on where you go, is to think about a time that you've engaged in a behavior that you're not proud of. It can be something small, an interpersonal interaction, or something quite large where you've made a decision that you knew was wrong. But go back and investigate, at what point in the process did you decide or understand, even if it was years later, that that was wrong, that it wasn't the way you wanted to lead? How did you know? And once you came to understand that, what did you do about it? Did you do anything about it? Did you agonize over it? Did you replay it in your mind? What would you do differently? And then ask yourself, well, why was it right? Why did I make that choice? What was positive about it? Work through the positive side of why you made that choice. And then finally go back for a second time to the challenges again. Why did you think it wasn't the right choice? What would you do differently presented with that situation again? Looking at it from both sides gives you the opportunity to get to a deeper understanding of your core sense of who you are, how you operate, and why you work in the way that you do.
Very good. And you suggest that leaders should design their desired leadership styles and interactions and cultural culture with focus intent rather than leaving those critical human elements to default. So, in
Yes.
that regard, what best practices have you observed?
Yeah. I'll start off just with a bit of the rationale. Again, I often ask groups, could you run a business successfully without a financial strategy? Sure, you could. I don't know why you would, because you know you're a lot more likely to be successful if you actually have a strategy and a plan and a way of executing against it in service of delivering the financial results that you expect to. I feel the same way about leadership strategy, which is, could you lead successfully without designing with intent the way that you want to lead and what you expect to get out of it? Sure, you can. In fact, most people do. But if there's a set of tools available to you to help you figure out how to do it with intent in a way that aligns to your desired outcome, why wouldn't you? And so for starters, and I realize I'm sounding a bit like a broken record on some of this, understanding your desired leadership style means, one, beginning with what is the outcome you're trying to drive, on what timeline, what are the results you want to show, what's your vision, what's your strategy for achievement of that vision, how does that require engaging other people. Once you're clear about all of that, to then go back to the broken record part, which is the deep self-introspection. Maybe you do it with a coach or an assessor, maybe you do it with a trusted colleague or a friend, but to understand who you are and how you got to this moment, what are the aspects of your style that are core strengths that you can draw on to align to that strategy that you identified before? And what are some of your own challenges, some of your opportunities for development, some of your own weaknesses as a leader that you want to try to smooth out at least a little bit or balance against yourself in the team that you build and in the organization that you build to ensure that you're able to achieve that strategy? That part, actually, a lot of leaders have gotten pretty good at with the rise in coaching, in leadership and self-help, in thinking with greater intent about leadership, and even training in leadership earlier in career. People have done a decent job of at least starting with some of that self-introspection and figuring out how their styles align to their desired strategy. But then what happens is you get lots of leaders who build a fantastic team by hiring a whole bunch of A players. And what we know is that A players do not necessarily make an A team. They make a great collection of A players. That's where the dynamics and interactions come in, the second part of what you referenced. How do they occupy the space between them? How do they need to interact? How do they need to show up in the room together and out of the room when they're not together, but still want to seem unified, cohesive, or aligned? The opportunity there, of course, is to use that same degree of self-reflection about the team that you did about yourself as an individual, and then to say, in order to achieve X, Y, Z, these are the things that we need to do in how we interact, operate together, again, literally or figuratively. And then finally, an organizational culture is not just an aggregation of individuals or an aggregation of teams. So what are the principles by which you want people to lead, to make decisions, the strategic priorities, but also the human, the interaction, and indeed the ethical priorities by which you want people to operate in their day-to-day. Designing those things with intent, never off on your own, but in collaboration with other people, highlights the fact that leadership is a fundamentally interpersonal activity and that it's something that we can manage. It doesn't have to be left to default. We can actually do something about it in a way that's good for our organizations.
Very good. And have you personally gone through these exercises and done this for your own leadership brand, if you want?
Everyone, and it's excruciating. It's excruciating. In fact, I do some of them in the book so that I can model for readers some of the painful parts of being able to go through these. The challenge is that you're never really finished. So as much as I know that I've gone through many of these, not just on my own, certainly versions of them with my team and with our organization, I also know that the minute you've finished, you have to start surveying the ethical context again. What we've seen in the last couple of years, more so than at any other time in recent history, is that the ethical context around how we interact as people and in communities is changing faster than it ever has before. A lot of leaders have been caught off guard by how fast the ethical context has changed, and it's led to some challenging decisions for business leaders, some very much in the public eye, when they haven't done that work in advance to self-assess, to assess the environment, constantly assess the environment, and check the expectations of their stakeholders. I've done it, but even by virtue of having this conversation right now, I'm reminded that it's probably time to start over again. Just because I wrote it in a book doesn't mean it's done for good in any way.
Very good. You said that the ethical context has changed significantly over the last few years. Do you have any examples of where they have changed?
I was speaking last night with a neuroscientist with whom I partner on occasion, and he was talking about, as a Black physician, his perception that a really big turning point in ethical context for providing public health support to minoritized communities was around the rise of the movement for Black Lives following the murder of George Floyd in 2020. That was a really crucible moment in our understanding of the importance of talking about the experiences of minoritized individuals and communities, but also targeting support for programs that provide resources for people in those communities, and that provide different kinds of professional opportunities, access, as well as understanding of the role of inclusion in our communities and businesses. That is something that has changed in the last 2 years. It's a massive change, massive change. There's not a company that we interact with almost anywhere in the world that hasn't grappled with its understanding of equity, inclusion, diversity, its own failings on those fronts, its opportunities for growth and change, its desire to make commitments of time, financial resources, et cetera. And I think that's something that will continue to evolve, no doubt. But even if we go back further, we can look at things like the role of romantic relationships in the workplace, once seen as relatively harmless, or if not harmless, at least something that we don't really talk about so openly. Nowadays, there are implications for businesses like CNN when their senior-most leaders engage in ostensibly consensual relationships that nevertheless end up, because of a lack of following the current ethical context, resulting in major changes to senior leaders' careers. These are things we have to be constantly paying attention to. The ethical context is always shifting.
So you touched on really important topics like diversity, equality, inclusion. Have you got any examples of difficult decisions that are related to those topics that leaders face today?
Sure. You can take a look at what's going on with the Disney companies right now and the challenges that they're facing with regard to their tax status in Florida. That is a situation that's playing out live. We don't know what the final result will be. But if we go back to where it started, the governor of the state of Florida, where Disney has much of its operations, changed laws pertaining to the discussion of sexual orientation and gender identity among elementary school students. Disney, of course, has long tried, ostensibly, again, to stay apolitical, at least in its comments about social issues. But if you actually look at their pattern of donation over time, they've provided lots of financial support to politicians whose votes and views were aligned to Disney's interests. They didn't necessarily tout that publicly, but their employees were well aware of it. And when Disney refused to make a statement about the law that many Disney employees and many of its customers found highly objectionable, the employees banded together and decided to go public, publishing a website, doing some internal organizing, and calling out the company that employs them for behaving in a way that they experienced as lacking in integrity. So what did Disney do? They tried to fix it in some way, but their actions were perceived on one side as being too little, too late, and on the other side now as being hypocritical. The state of Florida responded by proposing legislation that would change Disney's ability to self-govern and have implications for their tax status. And now Disney's caught up in a situation where they've made no one happy. Their stock price is suffering as a result, and it's not clear what will happen to their independence. What is clear is that whatever happens will only be on the far side of what is inevitably time-consuming and costly litigation. Something that seemingly could have been addressed differently if Disney was explicit about its expectations, its moral views, its ethical context, and its ability to meet the expectations of its many and very diverse stakeholders along the way. The problem was they were left scrambling after the fact and trying to figure all of this out in the midst of a crisis, especially under stress that heightens our stress response, is almost impossible. That's the reason that I encourage leaders to think about this stuff when you're not in the crisis, because when the crisis inevitably comes, and it has for all of us in the last few years, you're better prepared to be able to deal with whatever difficult decision is in front of you.
You suggest using moral code, ethical context, and role responsibility as a triangle when making difficult decisions. Can you give us an example of how this works in practice?
Yeah, sure. So again, think about, well, why am I having trouble making this decision? If I were to separate out the components, my own beliefs about right and wrong, the ethical context that I'm operating in, what's helpful or what's harmful, and my role responsibilities, what do I think each of these is telling me? And which are the two that are in most conflict? Then again, you go to the third to help resolve it. So in terms of a concrete example, imagine that a shareholder or a board member is quietly pressuring someone, or even at any level in an organization, maybe it's just your boss pressuring you to begin to think about indicating a higher degree of potential future performance than you genuinely believe to be possible. Why would they want you to do that? And why would that be within your role? Well, maybe they're saying, look, it's not about delivering on the performance per se, but it's about having some different kind of attention drawn to us realistically in a way that forecasts possibility, that changes the narrative about us. Once we've got that narrative changed, or whether that's internally or externally, obviously there are different kinds of laws governing this externally. Once we've got that narrative changed, then we can deliver a more realistic projection in a way that enables us to fulfill our stakeholders' expectations. But the problem is, you may personally believe that to be wrong. If I absolutely think this isn't possible, no matter how much manipulation I do at the margins of numbers, at the edges of spreadsheets, or even in the story that I tell, I just don't think there's any way this is possible. Well, now what do? I have a role to help shift this narrative, either internally or externally. I have a key stakeholder that's asking me to do it because they believe it's to the benefit of the total organization or to our total team or department. And yet, that set of role responsibilities comes into direct conflict with my personal belief about right and wrong. I don't think I should say something that I know isn't true. So in the face of that conflict, look to the third one. What does the ethical context tell me? What is most helpful and what is potentially most harmful? Making that discussion explicit can actually help you to influence. Ultimately, if your own morality is constantly coming into conflict with your role responsibilities, you always have the opportunity to pull the plug, to say, actually, I can't do this here. Mm-hmm. That's a card you get to play only once, because once you've played it, you probably don't get any more chances. But with that said, rather than going right to that nuclear option, can you instead use your understanding of the ethical context to help influence people who may come to understand the complexity in you or the conflict in your decision as a decision that they have to make for themselves too? Then you can join together to make the best possible decision, rather than feeling that that burden is left to you.
Very good. Do you have any examples of leaders that get difficult decision making right, and maybe an example of leaders that don't get this right?
Sure. Well, here's the challenge with the decision. You actually never know if you've gotten it right. All you know is what you've done. And so on the other side of it, you can say, did I get it right? I mean, you don't know what would have happened if you'd made another choice. And even if you attempted to go back and make that other choice now, in the end, the conditions are already different because you've gone further down the path than you were initially. So it's not always easy to tell. What we can tell is whether leaders have made those decisions with insight, integrity, and empathy. And those three factors generally contribute to stakeholders, even if they don't necessarily feel good about what you've done, being able to line up behind that decision. I give some examples in the book of via interviews with CEOs. I speak with the CEO of Ralph Lauren, Patrice Louvet, who talks about having to make the decision to furlough 80,000 employees at the beginning of the COVID period. An incredibly difficult decision, one that Mr. Lauren, the senior leadership of the business did not take lightly in any way, and how they grappled with their moral view about it, the ethical context that they were operating in, and the responsibilities of their roles to the Ralph Lauren organization, its people, its customers, and the communities that they're invested in. What you see is that they go through a very difficult process of trying to understand what are the various implications of the choices that they make, what happens if they don't make those choices, and what potentially creates the most harm to the world and to the company. The sign that they potentially made a pretty good set of choices. Roughly 80% of their employees returned following the furlough period. That's a pretty amazing sign about the values that company espouses, but also the ways that they live their values, that they understood their ethical context, and they were able to reconcile that with their role responsibilities in the moment. On the other hand, again, I gave the example of Disney. I use that example not because I think necessarily that Bob Chapek is making bad decisions. I think the challenge that he and his team have is that they waited too long to make a decision. Having not thought through that ethical context or the implications, waiting to make a decision or not making a decision is a decision. And so employees, customers, communities, the media interpret inaction as a kind of action. They interpret indecision as a decision. And therefore, the longer that you wait, the bigger the fire gets before you're able to put it out. That's a live example still going on today, will be going on for some time to come, but one that that the lack of a choice ended up being a choice that was pretty problematic.
In your book, you talk about insights, integrity, and empathy. Integrity and empathy we've covered widely. What's the role of insights, and how do you make sure you get the right insights to inform difficult decisions?
Yeah. Well, the role of insight, again, is about that mix of self-understanding and understanding of context. I like to say that morals are about looking inward, ethics are about looking outward, and role responsibilities or stakeholder expectations are about looking around. And so your insight is the degree to which you are able to accurately understand the implications or application of your ideas, feelings, and behaviors on whatever context you're operating in. Do I know how my style affects my team or how my style affects my organization? Do I know how my view of our landscape or my understanding of our landscape affects how stakeholders feel about engaging with me? The better your insight, meaning the more accurate your understanding of yourself, of your ecosystem, of your larger environment, and your ability to understand its application. What is this going to mean on the other side of making a decision? The greater the likelihood that you'll be able to make a good decision. There's one big problem with all of that, which is that we are terrible at figuring stuff out about ourselves and even about other people, because we see everything through the lenses of our experiences, our identities, our perspectives, our geographies, our cultures, whatever it is. So one of the best ways to sharpen insight is to get input and feedback regularly from other people. Do a 360, get somebody to do some stakeholder interviews for you to tell you what are other people seeing that you might not be. Whenever I meet with any employee in our organization, and again, we're in 10 countries, I very rarely see people in person, especially over the last few years. I almost always end with the same question, which is, what are you seeing that I'm missing, or that I should be paying more attention to? I ask that of every employee, regardless of role, regardless of level in the organization, because they're inevitably going to see stuff that I don't see. Now, whether they're candid with me about it or not, certainly I can imagine it's hard to tell some stuff to the CEO, especially if it's difficult stuff. But I always ask because I want to signal that I'm looking for that input, that insight from other people as a way of sharpening my own insight and understanding of context.
That's great advice. If you were to say one top takeaway for any leader that you would like them to take away from the book, what takeaway would you like them to take away?
Spend some time thinking about how and why you make decisions before you are faced with the next really big challenge. That's the whole notion of intentional design. It's the notion of introspection and self-reflection. But think about it now. If you want to do it while you're on a run, you want to do it on a Peloton bike. Speaking of a company that's had to make a lot of difficult decisions in the last couple of years, you want to do it in conversation with somebody else. Carve out a little bit of time, even an hour spent reflecting on the sources of your morality, on understanding your ethical context, and checking the assumptions and expectations of your stakeholders about what you're there to do will pay massive dividends when you are confronted with a difficult decision in the future. And again, if the last 2 years tell us anything, they tell us that some of the toughest decisions that will come ahead for all of us are things we've never even heard of yet. We don't know about them, and so we can't be fully prepared because we have no idea what they'll be. So instead of preparing for the decision, instead of trying to prepare the road, prepare yourself for the road that is ahead.
Very good. What are your hopes for the future then? If you look at the future of leadership, the future of business, anything that you would hope for?
I think my biggest hope is that all leaders, but also all workers, anybody who is working in an organization or on their own in any context, can get a bit of relief. it feels like there is an emotional burden, a psychological burden, a heaviness that leaders across industries, across companies all over the world have been carrying for the last few years. They carry it in part because of how deeply they care about people, how much they care about their work, and how much they believe in it. But to a person, the CEOs that I work with one-on-one across companies, across industries, are all carrying a degree of heaviness. Even as their fortunes are looking up, they've got an eye to the potential for conflict coming out of Russia and Ukraine. They've got an eye to risk around continued inflation, to the potential for a quite significant global recession. The uncertainty that's ahead has always been there. We never really know what's going to happen on any day. We get out of bed and put one foot in front of the other, in part because we kind of believe that we know what's going to happen. And if we spent too much time thinking about the full range of possibilities, we wouldn't be able to move. But my hope is that, recognizing that we really don't know what's ahead, I hope that leaders and workers everywhere in the world can get a bit of relief, a bit of a lightening of the burden, and an opportunity to get back to the core of what drives each of us in service of delivering what we're here to do in our time on this planet.
Very good. Thank you so much, Eric, for your time. That was a really enjoyable and stimulating and thought-provoking conversation. Anyone who wants to dive deeper into this, have a look at Eric's book, Difficult Decisions: How Leaders Make the Right Call with Insight, Integrity, and Empathy. And if you are up for more conversations like this, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel or my podcast. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you so much, Brendan.